So just like you did before, you're rendering out images and you're going to take them somewhere to change their size. Now before you did it in Illustrator where you scaled it to 200% using that cube. This time we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to scale to 150%. Just because if you go too big with stipple, it has a lot more danger of really merging into black blobs. So we're not going to go quite so big. But we're going to do this using Photoshop rather than Illustrator. So you did some stuff in Photoshop already, but let me just demonstrate this, then I can post this video if you need to refer back to it. So we've already done a couple of renders here, so let me go back to this one. So you're going to get something like this. It'll have a blue background actually. I changed mine by accident. So I'll save this out. So save image. Again, we're going to use a TIFF, and because the reason for that is because a TIFF can allow you to cut out this blank background if you want to. So this is H. Naledi Interior Tune. I'm just going to save this to my desktop to make it easy to find. And then we're going to use Photoshop to adjust this. So Photoshop and Adobe or Illustrator are both made by Adobe, so a lot of the shortcut keys and everything are the same. So just in Photoshop I can go to File and Open, navigate to that image on my desktop, which I've already forgot what I called it. Oh yeah, H-Naledi Interior Tune. So again, we've got the image and we've got that cube, which we know is 1 centimeter. So here in Photoshop, let me just hide all these things. You should see the rulers here up at the top and the side. If you don't, the shortcut for that is Command R, turn them off and turn them on. And to make sure that you are working in centimeters, you can just right click in one of the rulers. Just make sure centimeters is checked off. So if this thing is 1 centimeter in real life, we want it to be 1.5 centimeters here, so we can work that size. So I can just drag a guide over to, let's say, about 10 here. Next. A quick way to zoom in Photoshop is if you hold down Option and use your mouse wheel, you can zoom in. So I just want to get in close so I can see the scale here, because if I'm far out I just see 10 and then 12. I want to see 10, then 11, and then 11.5. So I can just reach into the ruler on the far left, drag out a guide, and I'm just deposit it here at 11.5. So I've got 1.5 centimeters measured there, I think. Yep. So this one's actually not too far off. It's a little too big. And the smaller you make it, the fewer dots you have to do, right? So 150 is better than 200 in this sense. So now how do I adjust this image? When you open the image, it'll just be a single layer. Layers work the same in Photoshop as they do in Illustrator, but when you open an image like this, it comes in as the background layer. And by default, the background layer is locked, so you can't adjust its size. So to unlock it, just double-click on the Layers menu, and if you don't have your Layers menu open, remember you can just go under Window, find any of these things, so the Layers menu here. You just double-click on it, say OK, it will unlock it. Now it's just a free layer. Now it's probably not a bad idea to make another layer, just as a blank in the background. So we just drag it underneath. We can fill it with another color later if we want to. So we want to move this layer with the image on it, so click on that layer. And then the shortcut to transform an object in Photoshop is Command T. And you'll see, you can see there's now manipulator handles around the periphery of my document. And so I can grab the corner one, will allow me to scale. in both the X and Y directions. But if I just click and drag and scale, you can see I can skew the size, so I can scale it disproportionately in X or Y and get a skewed image. So you want to hold down Shift once you start dragging. And if you want to scale it from the middle, while you're holding down Shift and left mouse dragging, if you hold down Option, it will scale in the middle, which actually is a little more convenient for this. So I'm just scaling this thing down. I can still use my zoom to go in. If I want to pan myself around, I can hold down spacebar, just move it around. And now I can just try and move this in between the two guides. So actually I did a pretty good job. You can also use the arrow keys just to nudge it over. And it's hard to see those. Oh no, you can see those guides there. So I just want to get it between those guides. So now I know that 1 centimeter square is in the real world at 1.5 centimeters. So I'm working at 150% essentially. And then to finish this, you can either click the check mark that's up here or just hit return on the keyboard. Okay. And so now you've got your working image that you can print out and trace from. So then there's a question about tracing, right? So before we did it, we had the magic of the computer where we could just put layers and change the opacity and just draw on one layer over the other. For me, this is easier to do by hand, but you kind of need some special equipment. You don't really, but it might be easier. So, for example, what I use is this, like a light box. So this is a very thin light box. So we just plug it in, just lights this up, tape stuff to it, and you tape. So you probably don't have one of these. With the vellum, you can probably see through well enough to see the image without a light box in the background. If you can't, then what I do is I use a window. I just tape my drawing to the window just to do that. Or if you have an iPad, I've done that before. I've taped it to the iPad, just put on a white screen, and you can use that for tracing. You could use a monitor, but I wouldn't suggest it because they're often softer than glass. An iPad has a glass surface. So you should be able to figure something out. And even if you have nothing, it'll work just with the vellum. I'm not telling you to buy this at all. I'm saying this because I just got this and I was really happy. It was like $60. I spent like a few $100 on one before when I was much younger, and it was this thick and this big, and it had like this flashing fluorescent light inside of it. It was an old X-ray viewing thing, but this is like it's great, $60. But anyway, you get the Amazon. If you have an interest in doing more of this type of work, having one of these is a kind of critical thing to have, a little a light table. So let me, now I don't know if this is going to work, but no, I'm not going to do that because I know it's not going to work. Let me jump back into Maya. And then we're going to stop and do our exercise so you can have a break from me for a bit. So remember, this is the workflow that you're going to do. You're going to render out from each image, probably best to render twice, once with the toon shader and once with the matte shader. And remember, to change the shader, you select the object, the mandible itself, right-click on it, and go down towards the bottom here, assign existing material. So I'm right-click, I'm holding down the right-click mouse button, and you can change from toon shader to matte shader. And you want to do 2 renders from each view before you move on to the next view, because you're going to have to move the lights around from view to view, and you want things to match up. The other thing too is, well, sometimes actually the fill light doesn't look too bad here, but it's probably better to select the fill light and turn it off for the toon shader view, just so you have core shadow. And even if you don't see reflected light here, I want you to try and use reflected light on parts that would be pointing down towards a lower right reflected light. So let me just show you how I have these lights set up. So you can see the key light here is out front and off to the left. And a fill light that you can use for the matte shader version is going to be down and to the right and closer to the object. So you can see it's farther back. Just while we're looking at this thing, I've mentioned it a couple of times, there's this black outline around the object. This is another procedural shading technique. It's called a tune outline. And what it's doing is it's looking for focal discontinuity in the scene. And whenever it sees focal discontinuity, it draws a line. So you can see that if we look at M3 back here, it's got this black line going around it. If I move my camera view, you can see the black line shifts always to be on the outline. And when this cusp here, for example, gets tilted up towards us, a black line starts to form to represent that shape. So this is a thing in Maya used for to make cartoony looking shaders that have outlines that move around with them. But I find it actually quite useful for first planning out an illustration. So you can use these lines as a guide. But as I say, that doesn't capture everything. So for example, this tooth here, so this is P1, premolar 1. This is the alveolar process here, so you can kind of see there's a bit of an edge. Maya is not capturing that line because it's too subtle, but that's something I would want you to draw because it's one bone with another. So a tooth with the mandible. So I put this line in here as a general guide for you, but you're going to have to look at the shape of the object and make some decisions yourself where other lines might be appropriate. And I mentioned in the assignment between discrete elements like teeth and mandible, but where there are strong focal discontinuities. So for example, you can see here there's this big scar in the not from the animal, but from the taphonomic process. It's a broken mandible. And Maya is rendering a strong line there. And I would agree with Maya there. There's a big focal discontinuity between the mandible here and inside this broken bit. So I would draw that as a line. And so here too, there's a broken piece between the mandibular ramus and the mandibular body. And so when we see it from the front, you can see there's a line that's drawn there because there's a big focal discontinuity between here, the body, and that part of the ramus. So I would draw that as a line too. But I would probably have it sort of thicker here and then tapering thinner as we get down here because the focal discontinuity is decreasing. It's greater up here, it's less down here. Okay? So you've done the two renders from the anterior view, then you're going to pop into your other views. Let's say we do the lateral view here. And I've included these blue planes that you probably see in yours. Like this one is the midline plane. This is in my display layers over here. If I turn that on, you can see it's blocking out part of the mandible. That's because when you draw something like this, now there are different ways to do it. You could draw the whole thing, but I just want you to draw the left side. So I put this piece of geometry here in the middle. So when we look at it from the left side down here, it's actually blocking out the other side of the mandible because I just want you to draw this side facing us. There are different ways to do it. Sometimes you would draw both, sometimes you would just draw one side. To me, it adds clarity, and it's a convention for some illustrations to do it this way. But if we look at this, you can see how Maya has put a line in here on the oblique line coming down, and I would agree with Maya there that there is a focal discontinuity between the ramus as it merges into the body, and it's putting a line there, so that's a good idea. There's here's that break again, and Maya's put a line between the body and the inside of the break, and that seems smart. Here's the mental foramen here. You'll notice that it's much higher on our critter, on the Homo naledi, versus the chimp condition. It's lower near the mandibular border. So something like that, the foramen, if it's a strong feature, you might want to draw not a circle, because it's still being lit from the upper left, but the line that is being cast into shadow, you might want to draw with a slight line. But you could get away just doing it with stipple too. So we need to change the lighting for this view. So we can go in and grab our key light and move it over. Make sure the lighting is turned on in that scene. And again, just I want to get it into the upper left. So if I look at this now, I'd say it's maybe not quite enough core shadow. We've got light struck region, halftone, going into some core shadow here. That might be a little too little. So we can look at moving that over. Because if you just look down in the bottom view here, you see this area of core shadow there. There's a change of form there that we want to capture. If the light is too far out, you can see it disappears. So I'm going to pull it in to give us a little bit more of a raking light, just enough to capture some of that form in there. So we get some core shadow down here in the mandibular border. We get some core shadow here, and this is where the ramus is merging into the body. We get some core shadow here in this broken area, and then we get some nicer, stronger core shadows here in the teeth. And it's a little hard to see on the screen, but the way I have the shader set up, you can see some reflected light just on the bottom edge of the mandibular border here. And on M3, you can see a little fleck of reflected light there. So that reflected light, if you don't necessarily see it all the time, I want you to think about where it should be. And it should be in areas that are opposite the main light, that are pointing down towards what would be the floor, where they go under smoothly, because light would come up and bounce into them. Okay, so I would render this out with this shader, select the object, right click, assign existing material, change it to the matte shader, and also render that out. This one I can turn on the fill light, just to fill in that area a little bit. Oh, that's too strong. Remember, this one is just a bit of a reference for you to look at. And you're also looking at the model, because you can come into Maya and look at this and examine it and see the form. So I want you to illustrate not just what you see, but what you understand about the shape of the object. So if your lighting is not showing exactly what you need to see, you can change your lighting, or you can enforce some form revealing by putting in some reflected light in the color here in your shading. So you're doing that, render, render, and then we would do the same thing for finally the occlusal view. And remember, if we just jump back here into the assignment, the occlusal view is going to be oriented in this way. So we want the light coming from the upper left here. So we have to shift things around again. Now I want to turn off that midline plane, turn on the occlusal plane underneath it, so we get the blue in the background here. And so I want to move this light until it's in the upper left. I'm going to put that shader back on, the Toon shader. Right click, assign existing material, Toon shader. So I'm just looking at my view to make sure I'm getting enough core shadow. So this one I might want to lower it down a little bit. So I don't know, something like this. I've got my fill light turned on here, so I'm getting a strong reflected light in here. If I turn that off, we're still getting it because the shader is finding it for us. So that's pretty good. So if I'm looking at this, I can see nice light struck region. You can see the form of the teeth is being shown very well by the light and shadow on them. There's a nice core shadow in here, some core shadow in here. So you can see the form with the light in this position. So I would render once, change the material, render again, change everything so they match the 1.5 or the 150% scale in Photoshop, and then you've got your references for drawing. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So I will give you time today to try this, and so when you, it's hard to remember all the little button presses and everything to get what you need to do in Maya, but hopefully I'll give you a chance to do that. Next week we'll talk about stippling, and we'll talk about rendering them a little more, and we'll talk about the layout and those extra elements that I want you to include. Because we'll talk about figurative elements next week.